John Immerwahr, a retired faculty member here at Villanova University, and I'm in the Duggan Polk Reading Room in Falvey Library. Today we're going to talk about the challenges and choices that artists face when they depict a scene from the Bible. There are, of course, thousands of artworks based on the Bible. I'm just going to talk about some works based on two stories, one from the Gospel of Luke, the other from the Hebrew Bible, sometimes called the Old Testament. And I'll have a couple of examples of different artworks, but the main one I'll use is this magnificent painting from the 1600s, done by an anonymous artist here in the reading room. It's about the triumph of David. So let's think about some of the problems that confront an artist depicting a scene from the Bible.
My Bible is over 1,000 pages long, filled with fantastic stories, but there is very little visual description of people or scenes. For example, in this story about the birth of Jesus, some magi or wise men come to visit Jesus bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But notice the story doesn't tell us anything about these wise men. If you set out to paint the scene, you'd have to fill in some details that aren't really specified. For example, how many wise men came to see Jesus? The Bible says nothing at all about how many men came. And where do they come from? And how old are they? Here's a picture at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, created by an unknown artist in the 1500s. The artist follows a long tradition and assumes that since the three gifts are mentioned, there might have been three wise men, one for each gift. And where do they come from? The artist suggests that at least one of the wise men is not European, and that emphasizes the global significance of Jesus' birth. And how old are they? This artist makes one old, one middle-aged, and another looking rather young, which suggests to us that Jesus is important to all people, regardless of age. In other words, the Bible leaves a lot unsaid, and artists must make choices of how to fill in the missing information. In the process, they also interpret the text, going far beyond what is actually said. Let's talk about another biblical story, David and Goliath. This one is a complex narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. It's also part of a longer narrative about a struggle between David and King Saul. We'll look at three different artistic versions. Michelangelo's David from the 1500s, it's in Florence. A painting from the 1600s by Domenico Feti that's here in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Villanova painting done by an unknown artist also in the 1600s. First, let's review the story. As the story begins, the Israelites are at war with the Philistines. A Philistine giant named Goliath challenges the Israelites to send a man to fight against him in single combat. The Israelites are terrified of the giant, and no one is brave enough to fight him. Meanwhile, David, a young shepherd boy, has come to the camp to bring food to his brothers. He tells the king, Saul, that he will fight the giant. He has confidence that God will be with him and he will destroy the giant. Saul reluctantly lets him fight. Michelangelo selects the moment just before David meets the giant. The Bible tells us that David is handsome and glowing with health, so Michelangelo makes him incredibly beautiful. We learn that David refuses the offer of a sword and armor. Instead, he takes his sling and chooses some stones from the river. If you look closely at his hands, you'll notice that he's holding one of the stones. Over his shoulder, he has a sling. So far, we have a static moment, but Michelangelo also propels us to the next part of the narrative. David has turned his head rapidly to his left, as though something has caught his attention. He sees the giant coming out to meet him, and he shows no fear at all. But why is David nude? Nudity is completely out of place in the Jewish tradition. Instead, Michelangelo draws on classical Greek and Roman culture that embraces nudity and makes his David look like a statue of a Greek god, emphasizing his physical beauty and his physical courage, portraying David as a Greek hero rather than as a Jewish hero, emphasizing David's human strength. Domenico Feti's painting focuses on a different moment of the story with a very different David. Here, David has already killed the giant by hitting him on the head with one of the stones, and he uses the giant's huge sword to cut off the head. Compare Feti's David to Michelangelo. Feti's David is a boy, dwarfed by the giant's head and the sword. It is a divine miracle that this boy could kill the giant. Michelangelo's David is formidable in his own right and looks down at the giant rather than up. He relies on his own strength and courage, perhaps not needing God's help. At the time Fetti's painting was done, artists often used stories from the Hebrew Bible to prefigure Christian stories. So Fetti reminds us of another divine victory. Look at the sword. It outlines a Christian cross, suggesting a comparison between David and Jesus. David has miraculously saved God's people, but soon he will face a new challenge from King Saul. In the same way, Jesus has come to save humanity, but now, with God's help, must face and overcome the last enemy, death. This artist has turned a static moment into part of a dramatic narrative and evokes a comparison for David. Now let's turn to the Villanova painting. It creates a visual narrative of past, present, and future. We see David carrying the huge sword, and we notice the dark figure of Goliath's head in the background, reminding us of the past battle. The Bible tells us that now the women praise David with singing and dancing, but Saul looks angry rather than pleased. He's jealous of David's fame and makes plans to kill the boy. David looks even younger here. Nevertheless, he steps boldly into Saul's presence. Saul, with a frown on his face, backs away, almost in fear. We visibly see the protracted struggle between the two that lies ahead. Artists often include subtle clues to guide our eyes to important parts of the painting. We may not notice these clues consciously, but they work on us. For example, when we see other people looking at something, we look too. Notice the two people with their backs to us. They are bystanders who are looking at what is happening. They subtly encourage us to look at the scene as well. Artists use other techniques to direct our eyes. For example, Goliath's head is dark and in the background. We might not notice it at first. The huge sword catches our attention and directs our attention to the head. In fact, the sword points exactly to Goliath's neck, where David decapitated the giant. But then we notice these three who are holding up the head. But even though there are three of them, they seem to be struggling to hold the head. This reminds us of how heavy the giant's head must be, and how amazing it is that this boy could kill him. Artists sometimes use geometrical shapes to emphasize things in a painting. For example, if we follow the line of the sword on one side and the women's arms on the other, we see one triangle with Goliath's head at the apex, and a secondary triangle beneath that reinforces the larger triangle. And now we see another triangle with Saul's head at the top. David, brightly lit, is almost in the center of the painting and at the apex of an inverted triangle. This reinforces the idea that this is the moment between the two stories, as though David is in the valley between two mountains, with one behind him and another ahead of them. And notice also that the giant seems to be looking at Saul, hinting that Saul and Goliath both have something in common. They are opposing God's will and must be overcome. To me, this painting suggests the struggle between good and evil as a long epic, not a single battle. As we see then, each artist brings a different meaning to the story. Michelangelo focuses on David's human beauty and courage. Fetti sees David as a precursor of Jesus. And for our unknown artist, David's triumph is a glorious moment, but only a moment in a struggle that continues. So thank you for joining me. If you're at Villanova, come see the painting for yourself. And click on the description below this video for links to my other videos on art at two of my favorite places, Villanova University and the Philadelphia Museum of Art.